I think the current system is such that it is obviously not encouraging people to stay here. So SIFC is an experiment in governance reforms, as the establishment thought it should be the case. The underlying premise of SIFC as a structure was we will create a superstructure which will sit over and above the current governance structure, the regulatory body. So will create a supra regulatory body, a supra governance.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good morning and welcome. My name is Abdul Rahman. I'm the president of Research and Debate Society, and today I'll be moderating today's session. Today we are tackling a very important question. Does Pakistan have the will to liberalize, or is the statist economy here to stay? We will be discussing the structural realities of our economy and the feasible path towards market reform. To guide this critical question and this critical conversation, it is my absolute honor and my privilege to introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Ali Salman. If I should say a word or two, Dr. Ali Salman is a renowned economist and the CEO of Policy Research Institute of Market Economy, also known as Prime Institute. And before we begin, please ensure your mics remain muted. We will open the floor for the Q&A towards the end. Dr. Salman, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Abdur Rahman, and thank you for arranging this discussion. I think we need more and more conversations like that to understand the economy better and the structure of the economy. And thank you all who have joined this morning. So because we're going to discuss quite diverse topics today, like the outline which we actually plan to talk about has components like market reforms, deregulation, institutional strengths, fiscal autonomy. That's quite a lot on our plate today. But I'm not going to, of course, address everything in one go. I think the focus would be mostly on the structural issues of the economy. And we will talk about, essentially about the idea of economic freedom. And then from the economic freedom, we will, take on the framework. We will take on like one case study of the structural reform, or something which is currently being considered in the policy circles, and what are the risks. And you will see, I think, within that story or case study, what are the obstacles and what is the way forward, and whether statist economy or political will, what is to be blamed. But I think more than putting, because it's a very, I think this question is a sort of, can also have a problematic conclusion, because if the question is not set right, then we can't really get the answers right. So we can get the right answers for a wrong question, and that doesn't help. So my focus, my objective would be to explain the idea of market reform, and then we will see where we are at the moment. And then, if time permits, then we can also discuss issues like fiscal responsibility or fiscal autonomy, or that those things can also be included. But I'm going to present you a basic framework of economic freedom, which is explained by the Index of Economic Freedom, and that's the only slide I'm going to show you. So I request you to pay attention, because then we will use that as a framework. Remember the key story. So I started from the rule of law, and then I went to the size of the government, and I was explaining the size of the government in terms of higher level of public expenditure, and the higher level of taxation, which reduces the economic freedom. Now, the third component of economic freedom is regulatory efficiency. By regulatory efficiency, I mean that is it easy to start a business and close a business in a country or not? And if it is easy to both start the business and close the business, then higher level of freedom exists, and if it is not, then the freedom is low. In Pakistan, for instance, we now see that it is relatively easy to start a business, but it is still very hard to close a business. To give you an example, if you start a business, you can set up a business in maybe a day or 3 days maximum, and you can be set up all with a new shop or a new factory. But let's say if for some reason the business does not work, and you want to close the shop in a in a year time, but then the law says that you have to keep the files, the tax files in particular, for next 5 years. So no matter if you are still in the not in the business, and business is not proving giving you any income, but you still have to file a return which will be a zero income return. But but if you're not doing it, then you will still have to face the law, or you can still be fined for not filing income. So those are the things which are still there in the system, which reduces the level of economic freedom. Then also in terms of the labor laws, labor contracts are flexible or they are not flexible. Um, is there a minimum wage law which is strictly enforced in a country? That if you have a higher level of minimum wage, for instance, there's a possibility that if businesses, if it is not affordable for businesses to hire employees, especially at small level, then they end up not hiring, or keep the whole hiring process informal, undocumented, because they don't want to be penalized for that. So these restrictions then reduces the economic freedom, but they also reduces in a way economic welfare. um, and the fourth and the last pillar is the market openness, and that is extremely important as well. So in market openness, you have three variables. First of all, we want to discuss, we want to see trade freedom. And by trade freedom, it means that is it easy or not easy to do international trade? Are the tariffs too high? Are there any customs duties, regulatory duties, which restrict international trade, but both export and import? And if the country is part of, for instance, free trade agreements or not. So higher the level of trade restriction by way of these rules, the higher level of custom duties, then lesser is the economic freedom, and the score is reduced, right? And then investment freedom is a part of the market openness. And investment freedom is that you want to bring foreign investors in a country, but then you want to give them sort of autonomy and choice to invest in a country. But when they are ready to take out their profit, and then they should be allowed to withdraw their profits. And if there are any restrictions on that, then the economic freedom is reduced. Um, and then finally, we have the financial freedom, which includes things like monetary freedom. Monetary freedom means basically idea of sound money. If the level of inflation is too high, then that freedom, purchasing power is naturally reduced, and your choices are reduced at the moment. It's also the things like whether you can open foreign exchange, for forex accounts, for foreign currency bank accounts or not, both inside the country and outside the country. Like if you want to, obviously it is not, we can't really open the account sitting here in another country. But even if we have forex accounts, we can't withdraw dollars. I mean, we can withdraw rupees, but we can't withdraw dollars which we have earned ourselves. So these are the restrictions which are still there, and they then sort of reduce economic freedom. And then they also force things like, okay, let's open an account in Dubai. Let's open a company in Dubai. You must have heard that many companies, many IT companies have moved their offices in Dubai and other jurisdictions because the tax rates are low. It is easy to move, it is easy to bring in capital, move the capital, make the payments to vendors, whatnot. And it is still very hard here, despite whatever we hear in the newspaper. And practically, it is hard. And the underlying act, the underlying legal framework which we still follow is the 1947 Foreign Exchange Act. So these four things, when we say economic freedom, you have to remember four things: rule of law, government, size of the government, regulatory efficiency, and market openness. These are the four important parameters and conditions of economic freedom, which will lead to higher level of uh, income and prosperity. Pakistan, according to this index of economic freedom, is rate quite low, which not be surprising. I think it is rated 152 at the moment out of 185 countries. And We are also included in the categories of least income countries in this, in this categorization. So there are like four levels of income groups. So those 185 countries are divided into high income, high upper income, then lower income, and the least income. So Pakistan is in the last quarter. Unfortunately, Pakistan is also in the last quarter of the Human Development Index. Those are the things which are all related in a way. So so these are the four. These are the framework of index economic freedom. Now I want to, I think, give you a very sort of a quick example of how the absence of freedom of markets affects our choices. Um, and how it actually increase the costs for those who are in the system. So I'll give you an example which you are mostly familiar with, and that is the electricity market. Right? And so we know that electricity market, the rates of, the tariffs are very high, both for residential consumers, for commercial, for industrial, for farmers. Everyone is complaining the same. Although a lot of people have switched to solar, but in terms of the overall, distribution, it is still a small portion, maybe 20% or less than 20% capacity in terms of megawatt is linked with solar, and there are other which are rooftop, but then a significant large portion of our consumers are still connected with grid, and they are paying very high costs, high rates. And uh, the when we say whether market is there or not, we have to understand the whole value chain of electricity market. So we let's think about the producers, the generators of electricity, then the distributions and the transmission market, and then finally the grid structure, and then the consumers. Now, if you look at how the generation market works, it has a component of both private sector and public sector. So there are public sector companies which are generating electricity, and then there are private companies which are generating electricity from different sources of fuel, like hydel, solar, nuclear, thermal, LNG, so all kind of. But then the rules are that regardless of whatever source of electricity you are producing, let's say you're producing the coal, which is the cheapest, or hydel, which is also quite cheap, but there are also there are grids, there are producers which are using the furnace oil, right, and which is very expensive. And so the so you don't get differentiated prices. You get one single price, which the government determines. Okay, we will determine an average price, and we will force all the consumers to pay as per the same price. Um, and also, there's a government agency which is called the Central Power Agency, which is the law says that all electricity produced no matter from what source, has to be bought by that agency and then has to be, transmitted to the grid through the systems, through the transmission, which transmission and distribution is all in the government control, which is where the lot of inefficiency, theft exist. And we although notionally these distribution companies are corporate companies, which means that they're not the government per se, but they're controlled by the government. Their boards are controlled by the government, and the appointments are controlled by the government, and so it's still effectively the state. And then which even those private companies which are there, which are generating the electricity, those IPPs you must have heard, they get the sovereign guarantees that means that they are promised a certain rate of return based on their equity investment, and the rate of tariff is adjusted to ensure that they get that promised return, and that they whatever returns they will get in dollar terms, while we are working in our in rupees. So they get an exchange rate protection. They get protected protected return on their equity, and sort of there's a government which is eroding, which is there's a government policy which kills competition. So both on the entry side, but also within the private sector market, the government rules restrict the economic freedom or competition, uh, which means that when there was load shedding, we were still suffering because of lack of electricity, and now there is much more surplus. There's much then the system available, the electricity megawatts available in the system is a lot higher than we need, but we still have to pay a lot. So that's I think the most challenging part right now in our system, in our economic governance, is the electricity market, and it is not just working. And we have seen the solarization impact has been quite positive, but then since more solarization means that people, consumers who are on the grid have to pay more, so government is in a real fix how to actually decrease that burden without, how to increase that choice and how to give people that freedom. So we are in a situation we are locked with that system for now. Um, so, a market reform in this market, electricity market, would entail importantly opening up of purchase of electricity. Also, government then impose these very high level of wheeling charges. That is that you to use the existing grid you have to pay extra. So it ends up that there is hardly any incentive for the markets to thrive. Now, what happens then? People who can escape the market, either they are very affluent customers who can totally go off the grid and can rely on solar and batteries, have done so, but there's a small number. Also, there are informal markets of distribution that is strictly illegal, but people still do it to escape that system and to escape the high rates. And everywhere you will see a poor quality regulation, government interference, and uncertainty in the policy environment keep hampering the market of electricity. And I think if you keep looking at keep if you apply the same framework and analyze different markets, uh, let's say, a sugarcane market or wheat market, you will find similar restrictions causing inefficiency, causing welfare loss, causing a loss in the investment, and also decreasing the economic productivity and investment in that sector. So there are price controls which are part of that framework I mentioned, and price control is an important pillar. I mean, the price freedoms that is an important pillar of economic freedom, and we see price controls almost everywhere. We see price controls in the exchange market, in foreign exchange market. We see price controls in commodity markets, and wherever these are implied, you reduce the incentive for investment for producers, and basically it leads to the consumer, welfare loss. So these policies, which are introduced in the name of popular politics or consumer welfare, even sometimes with the good intentions. Here the question of political will. Even if you're doing it with good intention, the consequences are horrible. And so in economics, we can't just be we can't be just satisfied with good intentions. We have to see the consequences. And sometimes there are seen for consequences, and sometimes there are unseen, unforeseen consequences. I'm using the terminology of Bastiat. It was a very famous small book, The Law by Frederick Bastiat, which if you have not read, you must all read. That explains this concept of how the economic philosophy brings results. And this is not straightforward. This is not common sense always, to be honest. You really have to understand how incentives uh, play in different markets and how the system work. So when these systems are imposed, then you create the people of course adjust. People want to find their own uh, if you look at the businesses are always profit maximizers. They should be. And in such situations, in an inefficient market, they find other ways of profit maximization rather than through competition, through research, through innovation. And that again reduces the level of economic welfare in the economy. And as that's a big struggle which we are facing. So while in Pakistan or in economic debate, we often talk about macroeconomic stability and things like inflation or tax rates, but the if you look at market structure, and if you keep looking at different markets, as I explained to you, you will find a lot of problems. And these are the problems which are referred to as structural issues in the economy. What kind of rules, what kind of regulations, what kind of institutions define the market and impact the market outcomes. And, I'll give you also one more example, and then I think I'll stop. And that one example is the market of medicines. Um, the for a very very long time, our medicines faced price control from year 2000 onward, till year 2020 21. Officially, our medicines faced a price control, and producers were not allowed to increase their price on their own. They had to apply under special rules, under special circumstances, and only the government authorities could allow a little increase in their price as per the inflation. But over the time, a policy which was introduced in the name of consumer welfare actually caused consumer welfare loss. In one of our studies, which was published by a Prime Institute in 2016, authored by Shahid Mahmood, the author showed that these restrictions of price control in the medicine market actually led to a consumer welfare loss of 108 billion rupees every year, because there was spurious medicines, there were shortages, investment left, there was no R&D, and even the basic first generation medicine became rare, which then led to inflow of local companies which could have somehow manage their production at a very cheaply and a poor quality molecules, cheaply produced poor quality molecules. And then ultimately those multinationals which had economies of scale in their production, many of them left the country. And by the time the government realized its mistake and foolishness, basically, the damage had been done. Now the market is relatively more open, but we keep on hearing about the stories which has how it has actually eroded the confidence and consumer, basically. So I'll finish here. Um, in terms of the basic argument, and I'm happy to have some conversation with you. Yeah.
So recently, if we have heard this initiative from the Federal Minister for Planning, Dr. Ahsan Iqbal Saab, and he wants to basically introduce this concept of bringing in expert technocrats to high end, uh, departments, divisions, basically like secretary level positions. How do you think will this change this status economy, like improve it? Because I think it's a well-known fact how these CSS class or this PMS class really hamper development, because everyone in each and every mega project, every bureaucrat or every politician has a stake in it, and they want a piece of it. So how do you think this introduction of technocracy will further develop the economy, or even more, like introduce market reforms and reform the organization, the departments they're heading?
First of all, I agree that our civil services structure needs a major overhaul, a major reorganization, and that goes to the very basics, like how they are recruited, how they are trained, and how they are placed, um, and what kind of then incentives do they face. Now, I'll first offer a general overview of the structure of our public services. So first of all, you have to see that of course there's one famous group, the DMG group, the PASS group, now it is called, which normally is blamed for okay, these level of inefficiencies in the system, the secretaries and all that, section officers. But then there are other groups which are more specialized in nature. For instance, foreign service, police service, custom service, income tax group, and there are others, or economist group, for instance. Planning Commission hires economists. So there are, I think there is people generally ignore that sort of there is nuance. There's not everyone is a journalist. There's a large pool of specialists available within the system, which work also at senior positions. But the system is such, the rules and regulations and the constitution is such that uh, we haven't changed a lot. So when you expose the same individuals, persons to that system, because these bureaucrats are there to run the system, they are not there to reform the system. This is not their job, actually. Their job is to run the system as per the books. And so we need to rewrite the regulatory playbook, right? And we need to rewrite the laws. So I gave you one or two examples of how archaic our laws are. And I'm not saying no one is paying attention, but we are not definitely not paying enough attention to the basic premise that where is the law? Do we need this law which was written 100 years ago? Certainly not. And we need to redefine everything. And if you, in this situation, if you bring top quality economists or bureaucrats, they would fail. You're setting up them for a failure. And time and again, we have seen excellent people who are there in the current system. Many of them, well-meaning, well-qualified, well-trained, but it's simply not working because we have loaded them with so much work or so much responsibility, which, for instance, doesn't the government doesn't have to do it. I'll give you one example which I'm more familiar currently, Ministry of Industries. So the Secretary of Ministry of Industries is not only responsible for the ministry, but he or she is also responsible for like 40 or 50 public sector organizations under him. And so, it is humanly impossible, even if you are very honest and extremely efficient, you're working 16 hours a day to actually be able to control and deliver good quality service, ensure the rules are enforced, ensure that the corruption is not. It's impossible. So a redesign of the system would mean that why do we need all these institutions like autonomous bodies to report to one secretary? So that should be finished. They should be reporting to their own boards, and run like autonomous, and the ministry should be reduced in size. And that's the direction of the reform is. And so hiring of such specialist um, can work temporarily in very limited ways, but it really is not changing the system, and it will not. We have seen, for instance, FBR. We have seen people coming from outside the system leading it, and failing. And so we'll continue to see this episode unless you redesign the whole system.
But my take on this is, if that we want to rewrite the books, I think if we look at the chief executives of every single province and the federal government, they do take some certain steps. If I'm being totally neutral, I'm not following any party line or anything like that. If we look at the federal government or Punjab government or KPK, they do take certain steps that does bring a certain level of reform. But then after a month or a two, they take on such moves that basically they take one step up front, and they take like step back forward like 3 to 2 steps. So like whether that is buying a jet, whether that is increasing the salaries of judges, of or politicians or anyone else, even though we're like living in such a crisis that the average man cannot afford basic things. So I think, do you, in your opinion, sir, do we have the political will? Does the politicians have the political will to do this, like this, engage in market reform to improve the country? Is it that on their agenda, in your opinion?
You see, more than the political will, it's a question of understanding and knowledge. Most of the politicians we have, they are not really aware of what kind of reforms are needed. And there is also a responsibility of people like us, the economists, think tanks, to create those alternatives, to create those solutions which can work. And I think that is also a lot of work needs to be there. It's we are not doing enough in that regard. So politicians do not get often the alternatives which they can implement. But the examples which you are quoting are different. These are not reform examples. Increase of salary is not reform. Buying jet is totally immoral activity at this point in time where the country is heading. So obviously, no question about that. So those things are really bad things. And But I'm saying that when you create new institution, for instance, our chief ministers in some provinces are known for creating new institutions, and then after 1 year they realize, oh, okay, there's already something wrong. So how this work, how these new institutions are created, are without any um, debate in the assembly, or let's say public debate, which can improve the system. So I think it's not just political will. There's always, of course, a political will, but there are other factors which have to be included in this whole um, discussion to realize that where we are and why we are there.
I actually had like two questions that I wanted to ask. So I will just make it into one precise question. Number one is very similar to the first query, that Pakistan has announced reforms many times, but investors often don't believe that they'll last because policies change with every government coming. So, how can Pakistan build long term policy credibility so businesses feel confident enough to invest in it? Also, even if Pakistan achieves that, Pakistan is also losing many of its skilled young people. Even if we introduce market reforms, what would convince talented Pakistanis to build their future here instead of abroad?
I think the current system is such that it is obviously not encouraging people to stay here, especially young professionals. We have seen the numbers in last few years, people who are leaving Pakistan. Although that number is, in my understanding, is now there was an increase, but there's a halt, and there's a possibility of maybe a decline in that number because of the not out of pure love for the country, but there are, of course, the decreasing opportunities in other countries for us. So, so people who leave the system obviously are showing their lack of trust in the system itself. We can't really stop it. First of all, we have to have some long-term planning, not planning in the sense of like a prescriptive planning, but more on like broader agreement on certain key economic policies, and that will help to some extent. But since we are, in a competitive politics in democracy, we can't really always guarantee that one policy will continue. So I think it is important to invest in the institutions which I mentioned. Those institutions are not built overnight. Those institutions need to be developed and need to be strengthened, preserved over time, so that they can provide a foundation for economic progress.
In the context of environmental regulation, I understand the market, if allowed to function in ideal conditions, can lead to innovation, but where the incentive for example, groundwater reducing groundwater depletion or other environmental externalities is present, where the short-term ramifications do not touch the market per se. How does a free market model uh, hedge against those externalities in the environmental?
And there's a constant, I think, challenge for the free markets, and there are also solutions available. One option which is available within the liberal framework is actually adopting the institution of community ownership, which is somewhere in between state ownership, central state ownership, and free markets, right? And Eleanor Ostrom, who she was awarded Nobel Prize for her work in environmental economics, and who died a few years ago. She worked a lot on developing solutions for environmental problems, the one you mentioned, by highlighting the importance of community controls on local resources or natural resources, not private ownership, not state ownership as such, but the idea was to create incentives for communities to own the resources, to preserve them for next generations, and to be able to efficiently use them also. So and those solutions which are now considered a quite consistent with larger liberal framework. So I would advocate that. So SIFC is an experiment in governance reforms, as the establishment thought it should be the case. The underlying premise of SIFC as a structure was we will create a superstructure which will sit over and above the current governance structure, the regulatory body. So will create a supra regulatory body, a supra governance body, a supra cabinet body, even which will oversee the functions, which will coordinate where needed, which will facilitate investors where needed, and that was the main premise. And then a department was set up in the Prime Minister office, and then of course at the higher level you have the military leadership there with the Prime Minister and other high officials. Now, after we have seen, and we were the one of the early voices as in Prime Institute who raised concern about the structure. We published a paper on that, that how this will not lead to the required governance reforms. And unfortunately, barring few exceptions, it is not proven beneficial for overall economic reform. In fact, those who are responsible now admit they're frustrated. It is not working because the underlying rules are not changing, and they can't drive everything by danda. So their philosophy was कि जी डंडा से हम ठीक कर लेंगे इकोनॉमी को, गवर्नेंस को. ठीक है, there are some transactions which they have facilitated. So their approach is quite transaction. Who can approach SIFC leadership? They can get their problems solved quickly. And the other investors or other companies which cannot approach, or those companies who do not want to approach the systems which are hidden, not accessible, not transparent, they create lack of trust in the system, and that is going to be that has proven detrimental. And then the basic objective was to bring some investment from government to government. I don't see, I haven't, really uh, seen that has also resulted into anything significant. Maybe one or two transactions you can mention, but by and large, that hasn't worked, and I'm not sure if this will work in the current manner.
As you talked about crisis in the energy sector, so is it really possible to go for free market reforms, especially in energy sector, when there are high unpaid billing cases and high electricity theft in Pakistan? So is it possible without the government enforcement or the rule of law with free market?
In the framework which I mentioned in the presented in the beginning, there are four pillars of that framework. The first pillar was rule of law, the enforcement of the rules, contracts, government integrity. That was there. So if that is absent or that is weak, then just price liberalization doesn't work. Price liberalization or price freedom is one part of the overall economic governance. You need that, but you just can't rely totally on that. Um, and if you look back and understand where the theft is coming from, where the inefficiency is coming from, it is coming from largely government presence in the whole system. And the rules, there are rules which say that, okay, how tariffs determined? Tariff is determined by including the costs of those distribution companies. Now, the cost means all the theft, all the inefficiency, all the chori is made part of the cost, and then there is a profit margin added to maintain a particular return on their profitability. And even then they're running losses, and then the government has to pull in by fiscal, the government when it subsidizes the energy distribution. So that's a big mess there. So we need to find a solution along these lines. Obviously, without rules, you can't really enforce. And in fact, you need rules to begin with to create markets. Markets are evolved as a result of contract or understanding. And market, what is a market? Market is an exchange. And how exchange happen? Exchange happens uh, by by rules, and sometimes those rules can be written, sometimes those can be unwritten, formal, informal. So you need all that to really go into an efficient market. And you see, for instance, the solar provides a very good solution, but we are stuck with the commitments to the IPPs. So solar is a market-based solution to reduce the energy costs, but we can't really adopt it because we made commitments to the investors for next 10, 20 years. And unfortunately, we are still talking about new contracts. We're talking to new IPPs being brought in the system. So that is criminal, and that needs to stop.
Sir, if I could just jump into this question, I have around two questions regarding this. First, regarding the electricity, is that why don't the government, like for its entirety, like since 1947, why haven't we really invested in nuclear technology, like nuclear reactors? Because obviously they're really expensive. some cost like $10 billion, $8 billion, which is not a really minute investment. And there's that risk of, if an earthquake can shatter, or some attack happens or whatever, that the nuclear radiation can really devastate the area. But then again, it's a really safe energy choice. So why haven't we really invested in that to like deal with the issues of IPP and the whole electricity distribution? And second of all, my question would relate to, like, you have been in the reform committees, you have had conversations with stakeholders, and you have worked extensively on reforms in general. So my question is, does the government actually believe, like, from its recent sale of PIA, like, to the private entities, uh, do they really believe that we should give up this state control? Like, do they believe in market efficiency, or they are just under the threat of IMF and other international bodies that you need to do these certain of things, otherwise we're not going to help you?
We have already adopted nuclear energy, and there's a reasonable portion of nuclear-based electricity production which is going into our system. I don't have right now the number, but it is there, and it is still in. It's. I think the government is considering even more. Nuclear is one of the cheapest sources of electricity production, and I would support it. You see, they are diverse sources: nuclear, hydel, coal, and we should adopt whatever is possible. And then there should be a decentralized system of purchasing, and the wholesale, residential, industrial, commercials. Consumers can buy electricity. Ultimately, we want electricity to be produced at a competitive rate. And so if we let that through creation of rules, transparency, it will be beneficial. The other question is more complicated. I sat on most recently, I was part, and I'm still a member of this Sugar Deregulation Committee, which was set up by the Prime Minister last year to deregulate the sugar market, to really open up the sugar market, which means no licenses, no restrictions on prices, no controls on trade, etc. An excellent initiative. We did some work a couple of years ago under Prime, and that report was acknowledged, was used in some of these deliberations. And I saw a lot of ministers actually supporting the whole idea. I can tell you that there was complete consensus on the reforms, not just between the stakeholders like within the government, federal government, but also in the industry. Industry is all supportive of deregulation or market openness, ending the license restrictions. And even the farmers had supported it. So when the farmers, industrialists, federal government has supported, what is stopping us? So then I realized that, okay, there is this federal structure, in which, of course, the agriculture is a provincial subject, and the rules are such that the provinces also have to agree. So one province, which is in this case, province of Sindh, they sort of had stopped all that reforms process. And right now it is still under discussion. So all the work was done over 1 year, and new policy framework was developed. But we haven't seen it being, like, final approval was not there, because one stakeholder, which is like one provincial government, said, no, we don't want re-regulation. We don't want these controls to be lifted. We still want all those protections and price ceilings and support price and all that. There is an effort going on. So it is very difficult to point out right now that whether it is, okay, the political will of all the governments, because in this case, I know there is one particular part of the government which objected. But this is frankly, I can't really tell everything, because there are certain dynamics which I'm not aware of. So I'm making these statements based on what is known to me and what is publicly known. But I see a lot of acceptance for that reform process in this case. So by and large, I think we have now in a situation where there is a broader agreement a broader agreement and acceptance of market reforms, but there's also a lot of resistance to it, both bureaucratic and political. And not much work is being done by academic economists, think tanks, etc., to support these ideas. And that is another, media, for instance, not much work is there. And so that means that it is very, you all need that kind of support, and pushback and appreciation, to carry these reforms. So it's not that simple that, okay, governments want something and it will carry through. We need a lot more forces in action.
So this was the webinar for talking about, does Pakistan have the will to liberalize its economy, or will the status economy be here eternally? So I think it's refreshing to see and hear some remarks by Dr. Ali Salman that yes, the federal government is in a lot of consideration, that yes, we should deregulate the market and bring up reforms. There are certain hurdles, which is the reality of every single government, that there are going to be hurdles when you're undertaking such a massive reform movement. So thank you again, Dr. Ali Salman, for this amazing session, being here with us, giving us your valuable time. My team and I are really, genuinely, really thankful to you, and especially Miss Sumaira Wasim, who has been with us, going back and forth through emails and everything, arranging this webinar. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Ali Salman, for being here and being with us and discussing about Pakistan's future and its economy. Thank you.